The Emperor sent his unwanted daughter as a joke, but the human janitor saw her true worth, HFY. The empire of Iridian stretched across countless planets, its vast power extending like a shadow over the stars. Its emperor, Tyran Velius, ruled with absolute authority, his grip unchallenged and unyielding. He had conquered galaxies, subjugated entire civilizations, and amassed treasures beyond imagination. Yet in the eyes of the emperor, there was one thing more valuable than all the riches in the universe: bloodline. Royal blood, the legacy of a powerful family. Tyran had many children, each from different unions, each one more powerful than the last. All but one. His daughter, Lyra Velius, was born with a defect. While her brothers and sisters grew into formidable warriors and brilliant diplomats, Lyra's health was fragile, her body weak. For all her intelligence and wit, she was physically delicate. As a child, she was kept in the shadows of the palace, far from the grand celebrations and the public eyes. To her father, she was an embarrassment. Her existence was a reminder of his weakness, something that couldn't be hidden away behind the walls of the palace. The emperor despised her for it. He would never show it publicly, but behind closed doors, Lyra felt his cold gaze. Every time she entered a room, she could feel the weight of his disappointment, his scorn. He couldn't destroy her. She was still his daughter after all, but he could make her life miserable. One day, Tyran sat in his towering throne room, surrounded by his most trusted advisors. The room echoed with the hum of advanced technology, the glow of holographic maps illuminating the otherwise cold stone walls. He looked down at the datapad in front of him, his mind racing with thoughts of expansion, conquest, and power. He had just crushed another rebellion on a distant planet, but this victory, like all the others, felt hollow. "It is time," he muttered to himself, staring at the image of his daughter Lyra on the screen. She stood there, delicate and fragile, her long, silver hair cascading over her pale shoulders. He couldn't help but sneer at the sight of her. His thoughts turned dark. She was weak, and she would never be an asset to the Empire. What could she possibly contribute? It was time to rid himself of this burden once and for all. "Send her to Earth," Tyran said abruptly, his voice cold and emotionless. "Earth?" one of his advisors asked, raising an eyebrow. "But it is a backwater planet. They have little technology and are of no importance." "It is nothing more than a colony." The Emperor's lips curled into a sinister smile. "Exactly. It is the perfect place for her. Send her there as a diplomatic envoy, but let her understand the truth. She is nothing more than an unwanted heir, abandoned by her father. Let her live among the humans, far from the glory and grandeur of our empire." The advisors exchanged nervous glances but said nothing. They knew better than to question the Emperor when he was in this kind of mood. He had made up his mind. Days later, Lyra stood on the edge of a transport platform, her heart heavy with the weight of her father's decision. The journey to Earth was long, and the isolation she would face on the desolate planet was almost too much to bear. She had always known her father saw her as a disappointment, but to be sent away like this was a blow she hadn't been prepared for. Her heart ached as she looked out at the shimmering expanse of stars. Was this her fate? To be cast aside like an unwanted relic? Her only solace was the knowledge that the humans of Earth wouldn't know her true identity. They would have no idea that she was the daughter of an emperor. To them, she would be just another lost soul, struggling to survive. As the transport ship hurtled through space, Lyra sat alone in her cabin, her thoughts swirling. She had spent her entire life inside the palace, sheltered from the outside world. What was Earth really like? She had heard the rumors. The humans were primitive, unrefined, barely able to handle the technologies of space travel. It was a dying colony, one that the Empire had forgotten long ago. When the ship finally touched down on Earth, Lyra stepped off the platform and into a world that felt completely alien to her. The air was thick with the scent of pollution, and the streets were filled with people going about their daily lives, unaware of the royal presence among them. The buildings were shabby, the streets overcrowded, and the technology seemed to lag centuries behind what she was used to. She felt small and insignificant. Here, no one cared about her lineage, her bloodline, or her father's empire. No one would bow to her. No one would whisper her name in reverence. She was just another lost soul, abandoned by her father. As Lyra wandered through the crowded streets of the human city, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. People passed her by without a second glance, their eyes focused on their daily routines. Yet there was a man, a janitor, who seemed to be lingering in the background, his eyes following her every move. His face was unremarkable, weathered with age and hard work. His clothes were simple, stained from years of cleaning the streets and maintaining the city's infrastructure. Lyra frowned, brushing the feeling of unease aside. What did it matter if someone watched her? She was nothing here. She wasn't a princess, and she certainly wasn't a daughter of the emperor. The janitor, whose name was Jonah, had been working in the city for years. He had seen many people pass through, but there was something different about this woman. She didn't belong here. He could tell by the way she held herself, the way she moved with an air of elegance despite the grimy streets beneath her feet. He had heard rumors about the emperor's daughter, the one who had been sent away as a joke. He had no idea what kind of person she was, but when he saw her standing alone on the street, looking lost and disconnected from everything around her, he felt an inexplicable pull to help her. Jonah had lived a simple life. He worked hard every day, cleaning the streets and fixing broken machines. He didn't have much, but he had learned something about people during his years of working in the city. People, no matter how rich or poor, how powerful or weak, all had a story. And from the moment he saw her, he knew that Lyra had a story of her own, one that was far more complicated than the rumors suggested. He decided to approach her. "Are you lost?" Jonah asked, his voice rough from years of hard labor. Lyra turned toward him, startled by the sudden question. She had been so deep in her thoughts that she hadn't noticed him until now. For a moment, she said nothing, her eyes scanning him carefully. What did he want from her? Did he know who she was? Did he understand the significance of her presence? "No," she replied quietly, her voice betraying her uncertainty. "I'm not lost." Jonah gave her a small, understanding smile. "You seem like you don't belong here. I've seen your kind before." "You're not from around here, are you?" Lyra was taken aback by the bluntness of his words. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of recognition. He saw through the walls she had built around herself, the walls she had constructed to protect her fragile heart. This man, this janitor, saw her, not as a princess, not as the emperor's daughter, but as a person. "I'm just trying to find my place," she muttered, looking down at the ground. Jonah didn't say anything more. He simply nodded and walked away, leaving Lyra to contemplate his words. It was the first real conversation she had had since her arrival on Earth, and in some strange way it felt comforting. He didn't look at her with pity or disdain. He simply saw her. And for the first time in her life, Lyra wondered if she had been wrong about everything. Maybe Earth wasn't so much of a punishment after all. Maybe, just maybe, it was a place where she could find something she had never known: freedom. The days following Lyra's arrival on Earth were a blur of confusion, loneliness, and quiet introspection. She found herself wandering the city's streets, her mind a tangled mess of thoughts. She was far from the glittering palace she had known, and the emptiness that surrounded her felt like a cold reminder of how little her father thought of her. In the grand scheme of the galaxy, she was nothing, a mere afterthought discarded in a forgotten world. Yet, as the days passed, she began to see Earth in a different light. At first, it seemed like a chaotic and disorderly place, filled with noise, pollution, and people who didn't care about her, or anyone for that matter. The humans lived their lives, absorbed in their own struggles, unaware of the powerful empire that stretched across the stars. But the longer Lyra stayed, the more she realized that Earth was more than just a barren planet. It was alive with stories, with struggles, with hope. One morning, as Lyra wandered through the bustling streets, she spotted the janitor again, Jonah. He was sweeping the sidewalk, his movements slow but deliberate, as if each stroke of the broom was a part of a larger rhythm. He worked with a kind of quiet determination, his face etched with the wear of years spent in the service of others. Unlike the other humans who barely noticed her as they hurried past, Jonah looked at her, not with pity but with a kind of quiet understanding. She hesitated, but something inside her urged her to approach. There was something about him, something that made her feel less alone in a world that seemed to have no place for her. She walked up to him, her steps tentative but steady. "You work here every day?" she asked, her voice a little more than a whisper, unsure of what she even wanted to hear. Jonah paused his sweeping, glancing up at her. His eyes were tired but warm. "Yeah," he replied simply, giving her a small nod. "It's a job, keeps me busy." Lyra felt a pang of something she couldn't name. Here was a man who worked tirelessly, day after day, for little recognition or reward. He had no empire to rule, no title to protect, and yet he seemed content. There was something about that contentment, something about the simplicity of his life, that made her feel a strange sense of comfort. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly, her words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I'm not used to this. I don't belong here." Jonah gave a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "None of us really belong anywhere, do we?" he said, his voice laced with a quiet wisdom. "We just have to make do with where we are." Lyra stared at him, taken aback by his words. It wasn't what she had expected to hear. She had expected him to tell her she didn't belong either. After all, she had been cast aside, a useless heir with no purpose. But Jonah didn't see her that way. He didn't judge her or pity her. He simply spoke to her like she was anyone else. For the first time in days, Lyra felt a sense of calm wash over her. She wasn't some royal princess in a gilded cage anymore. Here, in this bustling human city, she was just a person. She could be anyone. She could be free. Over the next few days, Lyra and Jonah began to cross paths more often. At first, it was just brief encounters, the kind that could be easily dismissed as coincidence. But soon, their conversations became more frequent. Lyra would sit on a bench near the park, watching the world go by, and Jonah would stop by on his rounds, offering a few words of comfort or simply a quiet smile. Each time they spoke, Lyra found herself feeling more at ease. Jonah wasn't interested in who she was or where she came from. He didn't care about her royal bloodline or her father's empire. He only cared about the person standing in front of him, and that made all the difference. One afternoon, as they sat together on the bench, Lyra found herself opening up to him in a way she had never done before. She told him about her life in the palace, about the coldness of her father's gaze, the pressure to live up to expectations that were beyond her reach. She told him about her fear of being forgotten, of being nothing more than a burden to the empire. "I'm not meant to be here," she said softly, her eyes downcast. "My father, he sent me away. He didn't care what happened to me." Jonah listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When she finished speaking, he didn't offer words of comfort or try to make her feel better. He simply nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "You know," he said after a long pause, "we all have a role to play. Some people are born to rule, some are born to serve, and some just have to survive. But none of that matters if you can't find your own worth. Your father might see you as a burden, but that doesn't mean you are one." Lyra looked at him, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She had never considered it that way before. For so long, she had defined her worth through her father's eyes, through the expectations of an empire that never cared for her. But maybe Jonah was right. Maybe her worth wasn't tied to her bloodline or her father's approval. Maybe her worth was something she had to discover for herself. "I don't know how to start," Lyra admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent my whole life trying to be what everyone else wanted me to be. Now I don't know who I am anymore." Jonah smiled gently, his eyes kind. "You start by being yourself. You start by deciding what you want, not what someone else expects from you. It's never easy, but it's the only way to live." For the first time since her arrival on Earth, Lyra felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't a grand, sweeping hope. It was small, quiet, but it was there. Maybe she didn't have to be the Emperor's daughter. Maybe she didn't have to be the perfect heir or the obedient princess. Maybe she could simply be herself. That evening, as she walked through the streets of the city, Lyra felt a sense of freedom she had never known before. The air felt lighter, the world seemed a little less hostile. She was still a long way from understanding who she truly was, but she no longer felt as lost. Jonah's words echoed in her mind as she made her way back to the small apartment she had been assigned. The world outside was still chaotic, still full of uncertainty and struggle, but it no longer seemed so overwhelming. She wasn't alone. She had found someone who understood her, someone who saw her for who she was, not what she was expected to be. As the days passed, Lyra began to explore the city more. She spent time with Jonah whenever she could, learning about the simple joys of human life. They would visit the market together, laughing at the vendors' antics, or sit by the river, watching the sunset in silence. In these quiet moments, Lyra began to realize that perhaps this was what she had been missing all along. Not the grandeur of her father's empire, not the power that came with her bloodline, but the simple connections that made life meaningful. One evening, as the two of them sat on the same bench where they had first met, Jonah turned to her, his eyes serious. "You're not who you were when you first got here," he said quietly. "You've changed, and I think it's a good change." Lyra smiled, a small but genuine smile. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was on the right path. She wasn't sure where it would lead, but she no longer feared the future. She had found something more important than power or status. She had found herself. Lyra's life on Earth was beginning to take shape in ways she had never anticipated. Each day was a quiet revelation, each encounter with the people of this strange world marking another step toward understanding who she was. For the first time, she was free from the shadow of her father's expectations, free from the suffocating role of being the Emperor's daughter. Here, on Earth, she was just a person, a woman who had the chance to choose her own path. Her time spent with Jonah, the janitor who had become her unlikely friend and confidant, continued to shape her understanding of what it meant to be human. He had shown her a side of life that she had never known, a life that wasn't defined by titles or power, but by simple acts of kindness and resilience. As the days turned into weeks, Lyra felt a deep connection to the people around her. She began to see the beauty in their daily struggles, their capacity for love and hope despite the hardships they faced. But even in the quiet corners of the human world, shadows loomed. Lyra knew that her father's empire did not forget easily. Her disappearance from the palace would not go unchallenged. Her father had sent her away not as an act of mercy, but as an exile, and his sense of pride and control would not let her live out her days as a forgotten princess on a distant planet. She knew the Emperor's reach extended far beyond the borders of Eridian. Eventually, someone would come for her. One afternoon, while Lyra was walking through the crowded streets of the city, she noticed a group of strangers standing near the marketplace. They were dressed in dark uniforms, their eyes scanning the crowd with cold precision. They didn't belong here. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. These were not ordinary humans. She could feel it. There was something off about them. As she walked past them, she caught a glimpse of their insignia, an eagle with wings outstretched, the symbol of the Eridian Empire. Her blood ran cold. Her father had sent his soldiers to bring her back. In the days that followed, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The soldiers had been discreet, but she knew they were here for her. The Emperor had never been one to let go of what he considered his property. And Lyra, though she had become fond of her new life on Earth, knew she could not run from her past forever. Jonah noticed the change in her. He had seen her grow more withdrawn, more anxious in recent days. She was no longer the bright, free-spirited woman she had been when they first met. Her shoulders were tense, and her eyes, usually full of curiosity, now seemed distant. "What's wrong, Lyra?" Jonah asked one evening as they sat by the river, watching the sunset. The orange glow of the setting sun reflected off the water, but Lyra's thoughts were far from the peaceful scene in front of her. "I think they've come for me," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the sound of the flowing water. "My father's men, I've seen them, I know they're here." Jonah didn't say anything at first. He knew what this meant. Lyra had always been careful not to speak of her past, not to reveal too much about who she really was. But he could see the truth in her eyes now. She was more than just a woman trying to make a life on a foreign planet. She was someone with a past that could never be erased, no matter how hard she tried. "I won't let them take you," Jonah said firmly. His voice was filled with determination, and for the first time Lyra saw something in him she hadn't expected: bravery. He wasn't just a janitor, a humble worker who had no reason to care about her problems. He was a man who would fight for what he believed in, and he believed in her. Lyra looked at him, her heart filled with gratitude. "You don't have to. It's not your fight." Jonah shook his head. "It's our fight now. They came to Earth. That makes it our fight." Lyra's heart swelled with emotion. She had never imagined that a simple janitor would stand by her like this. Jonah wasn't a soldier, wasn't a hero by any traditional measure. But his actions spoke louder than any title ever could. He had seen her not as a princess or a burden, but as a person worth fighting for. And that meant more to her than anything her father could ever offer. In the days that followed, Jonah and Lyra began to plan. They couldn't hide forever. The soldiers were getting closer, and the city streets were crawling with those who had been sent to find her. Earth wasn't the quiet, isolated world it had once been. It was now the battleground for her freedom. They couldn't face the soldiers head-on. Not yet. Lyra had no weapons, no army, and no power. But what she had learned from her time with Jonah and the people of Earth was that even the smallest voices, when united, could become something far stronger than any empire. Jonah took Lyra to meet people who could help. He knew the underbelly of the city, the places where people lived outside the reach of the Empire's law. They met with mechanics, hackers, and former soldiers, humans who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from fighting back. Each person they met had a different story, a different reason for wanting to resist the Empire's tyranny. Some had lost loved ones in previous conflicts, others had been oppressed by the Iridian government for generations. But they all shared one thing: a burning desire to see the Empire fall. Lyra had never imagined that the humans she had once seen as weak and helpless would become her greatest allies. They weren't as technologically advanced as the Iridian Empire, but they had something the Empire didn't: heart. And that heart was about to set the galaxy on fire. One evening, after a particularly tense meeting, Lyra stood with Jonah on the rooftop of an old warehouse, looking out over the city. The stars twinkled overhead, a silent reminder of the vastness of the universe. Lyra felt a deep sense of purpose within her. She had never asked for this fight. She had never wanted to be the leader of a revolution. But here she was, surrounded by people who believed in her, who believed in the future they could build together. "I don't know if we can win this," Lyra said quietly, her voice full of uncertainty. "The Empire is powerful. They have weapons, armies, fleets. How can we possibly stand against them?" Jonah's gaze was steady, unwavering. "We don't have to win by their rules," he said. "We have something they don't: unity. The humans of Earth might not be as powerful as the Iridian, but we have the strength of numbers, and we have the will to fight for something bigger than ourselves." Lyra looked at him, her heart full of emotion. He was right. She had spent her whole life defined by her bloodline, by the Empire's power. But now she was part of something bigger. She wasn't just a princess or an heir to a throne. She was a symbol. A symbol of resistance, of hope, of the possibility that even the smallest spark could ignite a revolution. The days that followed were filled with preparations. They moved quickly, gathering allies, securing weapons, and making sure the people who would stand with them knew what was at stake. The Empire's soldiers had already begun to tighten their grip on Earth, and Lyra knew they didn't have much time. They had to act before the Empire crushed them all. As the final plan came together, Lyra stood in the midst of the growing rebellion, surrounded by people who had once been strangers, but who now felt like family. She was no longer just the Emperor's unwanted daughter. She was a leader, and this was her fight. The time had come. The Emperor's men would come for her, but they would soon learn that they had underestimated the strength of a human spirit united by a common cause. Earth would not be a pawn in the Empire's game. It would be the beginning of something much greater. The night had fallen over Earth, a quiet blanket of stars above, but the streets below were alive with a quiet tension. Lyra stood in the makeshift command center, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never imagined herself in this position, leading a revolution against the Emperor, the most powerful man in the galaxy. And yet, here she was, standing shoulder to shoulder with humans who had once been strangers, now united under a common cause. Jonah was beside her, his face calm but determined. He had been a constant presence throughout this journey, steady, unwavering, and brave. Lyra had learned so much from him, more than she could ever have imagined. His belief in her, his faith in humanity, had given her the strength to believe in herself. Now, they were about to take the first step toward something far greater than any one of them. "We're ready," Jonah said quietly, his voice full of resolve. Lyra nodded, taking a deep breath as she surveyed the room. The rebellion had gathered here, in secret, in the heart of the city's abandoned industrial district. There were men and women of all ages, former soldiers, engineers, hackers, and civilians, united in their desire to see the Empire crumble. They had no fancy weapons, no advanced technology, but they had something far more powerful: hope. And hope, Lyra had learned, could be the most dangerous weapon of all. "Remember, we're not just fighting for Earth," Lyra said, her voice rising with emotion. "We're fighting for freedom, for the chance to live without fear, for the future we want to build together." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them all. There were no grand speeches, no promises of victory, only the understanding that they were doing what they believed was right. It was enough. Jonah placed a hand on Lyra's shoulder, his gaze meeting hers. "We're with you," he said simply. Lyra smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. She wasn't alone, not anymore. She had found her strength in the people around her, and together they would face whatever the Empire threw their way. The plan was simple but dangerous. The Empire's soldiers had already begun to make their presence known across Earth, tightening their grip on the cities. But they had underestimated the humans they thought were weak. They had underestimated the power of a united people. The rebellion had spent weeks gathering intelligence, sabotaging key Imperial supply lines, and building an underground network that could disrupt the Empire's control. Tonight, they would strike. The rebels moved quickly, slipping through the shadows as they made their way to key targets across the city. Lyra felt the weight of the moment settle over her. She was no longer the exiled princess, the forgotten daughter of a cruel emperor. She was a leader, a symbol of resistance, and as she watched the rebels move into position, she felt a sense of purpose she had never known before. Jonah was with her every step of the way. He was no longer just the janitor she had met on the streets, no longer just a simple man who cleaned the city streets. He was a fighter, a hero in his own right, and together they would make their stand. The first wave of the attack came at dawn. The sky was just beginning to lighten, the first rays of sunlight creeping over the horizon as the rebels launched their assault. Lyra stood on the rooftop of an old warehouse, watching as the streets below erupted in chaos. The Empire's soldiers, caught off guard by the sudden attack, scrambled to organize their defenses. But it was too late. The rebels hit them hard and fast, targeting key communication hubs and supply lines. The Empire's advanced technology, which had once seemed unstoppable, was no match for the clever tactics of the humans who had lived in the shadows for so long. The battle raged in the streets below, a chaotic clash of fire and smoke, but Lyra felt a deep sense of calm. This was what they had been fighting for. This was their moment. Jonah appeared beside her, his face grim but determined. "They'll come for us soon. We need to move." Lyra nodded, her heart racing. The Empire's forces were already mobilizing. They had to act fast before the tide turned. The rebellion had the element of surprise, but that wouldn't last forever. The soldiers were relentless, and they had resources the rebels could only dream of. But it didn't matter. The rebellion had something more, something the Empire had never truly understood: the strength of the human spirit. They moved swiftly through the streets, rallying the rebels as they went. Lyra's presence seemed to inspire everyone she encountered, her calm determination acting as a beacon of hope in the midst of chaos. It was as if they had been waiting for someone to show them that they weren't powerless, that they could make a difference. By the time the Empire's reinforcements arrived, the rebellion had already taken control of the key strategic points in the city. The soldiers were disoriented, confused by the sudden shift in power. But the rebellion's victory was still far from certain. The Empire was not known for its mercy, and Lyra knew that the Emperor would stop at nothing to reclaim what he saw as his property. As the day wore on, the fighting intensified. Lyra found herself at the heart of it all, her thoughts focused on the task at hand. She had come a long way from the frightened, isolated princess who had first set foot on Earth. She had learned what it meant to stand up for what was right, to fight for those who could not fight for themselves, and she would not stop now. The Empire's soldiers advanced, their weapons raised as they closed in on the rebellion's stronghold. Lyra could hear the sounds of gunfire and explosions in the distance, the chaos of battle all around her. But through it all, she stood firm. She was no longer afraid. Jonah appeared beside her once more, his face smeared with dirt and sweat. "We've held them off for now, but they'll keep coming," he said, his voice steady despite the danger. "We need to end this now before it's too late." Lyra looked at him, her eyes filled with determination. "We will," she said quietly, "but we need to make sure the people are safe first." Together, they led the rebels to the heart of the city, where the final battle would take place. The Empire had sent its elite forces, its most powerful soldiers, to crush the resistance once and for all. But Lyra knew that this fight was more than just about winning. It was about proving that no empire, no matter how powerful, could crush the spirit of freedom. As the battle reached its peak, Lyra found herself face to face with the Empire's commander. He was tall, imposing, and dressed in the black armor of the Emperor's elite guard. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment she saw a flicker of recognition. He knew who she was. He knew what she represented. "You can't win, princess," the commander sneered. "Your rebellion is nothing more than a fleeting dream." Lyra didn't flinch. She had heard those words before. "Maybe," she said quietly, "but it's a dream worth fighting for." With that, the final battle began. The clash was fierce, a blur of weapons and shouting as the rebellion fought with everything they had. Lyra and Jonah fought side by side, their movements synchronized, their resolve unshakable. The battle stretched into hours, but in the end the Empire's forces were overwhelmed. The rebels had won. Earth had been liberated. As the dust settled and the sound of battle faded, Lyra stood in the midst of the ruined city, her heart full of triumph. She had done it. They had done it. The Empire had been defeated and Earth was free. Jonah stood beside her, his expression one of quiet pride. "We did it," he said simply. Lyra looked out at the horizon, the first light of dawn breaking over the city. She had found her place here, not as the emperor's daughter but as a leader of the people. And she knew that this was only the beginning. Earth was free, but the fight for freedom would continue across the stars. And Lyra, once the unwanted daughter of an empire, had become a symbol of hope for all those who believed in the power of the human spirit.